March 15, 1781. Guilford Courthouse, North Carolina. The British guards are breaking through the final American line. Smoke hangs between the trees. Muskets flash at distances so short that men can see the whites of one another's eyes. Bayonets come forward. The American infantry begins to bend. Then one soldier steps into the gap. His name is Peter Francisco. He is still only about 20 years old, but he is already famous inside the Virginia line for his size. Later tradition will describe him as more than 6 feet tall and enormously strong. What the records prove is simpler. He has already survived Brandywine, Germantown, Stony Point, Camden, and multiple wounds that should have ended his service. Now a British bayonet drives into his leg and tears upward from near the knee toward the hip. Francisco does not fall away from the fight. He keeps swinging. Later stories will claim that he kills 11 enemy soldiers with a massive sword. That number cannot be verified, and the famous weapon attached to his legend may never have existed in the form people imagine. But the battle itself is real. The wound is real. His presence in the final struggle is real. And the British army that wins this field will lose nearly a third of its strength doing it. Peter Francisco's life became buried beneath so many legends that it is easy to miss the most remarkable truth. The documented soldier was already extraordinary. He did not need the myths. To understand how a boy who arrived in Virginia without a family became one of the Revolution's most famous enlisted men, we have to begin with a mystery. Around 1765, a small child appeared at City Point on the James River near modern Hopewell, Virginia. He wore fine clothing. He spoke a language local people did not understand, later identified as Portuguese or another Iberian dialect. No parent came forward. No reliable document explained who had left him there or why. The boy eventually became known as Peter Francisco. Tradition holds that he was taken into the household of Anthony Winston, a prominent Buckingham County planter and relative of Patrick Henry. He grew up in rural Virginia and learned the work of a blacksmith. That trade matters. A blacksmith's strength is not built for display. It is built through repetition, lifting iron, swinging a hammer, controlling weight while heat burns against the face. Later generations would exaggerate Francisco until he became almost a folk creature. The Virginia giant, the Hercules of the Revolution, George Washington's one-man army. The exact measurements attached to him, 6 feet 6 inches, more than 260 pounds, come from later accounts rather than firm wartime records. But every tradition agrees on the central point. He was unusually large, unusually powerful, and impossible to overlook. In 1776, still a teenager, Francisco enlisted in the Virginia Continental Line. His own later petitions to the Virginia legislature provide the strongest foundation for reconstructing his service. He stated that he volunteered near the beginning of the war and served for 3 years under George Washington in the Northern campaigns. That meant leaving the world he knew and joining an army that was still learning how to survive. By 1777, Washington's army faced the main British offensive against Philadelphia. At Brandywine on September 11, British forces outmaneuvered the Americans and forced them from the field after a long, violent fight. Francisco was there. 3 weeks later at Germantown, Washington attempted a complicated surprise attack through darkness and fog. Units lost direction. Smoke and confusion shattered coordination. The Americans withdrew. Francisco was there too. These battles did not create an easy legend. They created a soldier. He learned what retreat looked like. He learned how quickly an ordered line could become a crowd. He learned that courage did not guarantee victory. He also learned how much punishment the Continental Army could absorb without disappearing. The following winter at Valley Forge exposed the army to hunger, disease, and cold rather than British fire. Francisco's exact daily experience there is difficult to reconstruct, but his regiment belonged to the force Washington was trying to preserve and rebuild. When the army emerged, it was better trained. Francisco was no longer simply a powerful young recruit. He was becoming an experienced Continental infantryman. In July 1779, he took part in the assault on Stony Point along the Hudson River. This was not a conventional daytime battle. General Anthony Wayne's force approached at night. Muskets were kept unloaded to prevent accidental firing. The assault depended on bayonets, discipline, silence, and momentum. Francisco later identified Colonel Francois de Fleury as one of the officers under whom he served during the attack. The Americans stormed the fortifications and captured the post in a brief, savage action. Some later retellings place one of Francisco's great wounds here. His own later petition described a cut or wound running diagonally across his abdomen for roughly 9 inches, followed by a recovery at Fishkill. The wording is blunt. It does not tell us how terrified he was, how much blood he lost, or what it felt like to wonder whether the wound would close. It tells us only that he survived. This is the first major retention engine of Francisco's story, not that no one could injure him. They did, not that he never fell, he did. The remarkable fact is that every time the war opened his body, he found a way back into it. After his original term of enlistment, Francisco could have gone home permanently. He had already served through some of the hardest campaigns in the north. He had already been wounded. He had fulfilled what he had promised. Then the war shifted south. Charleston fell in May 1780, taking thousands of American soldiers with it. The British spread across South Carolina. General Horatio Gates marched south with a new American army and met Cornwallis near Camden in August. Francisco volunteered again. His later petition places him in Gates's army and attached to a Virginia regiment under Colonel John Mayo. The Battle of Camden began before dawn on August 16, 1780. The American army was tired, badly arranged, and weaker than Gates understood. When British regulars charged, inexperienced militia on the American left collapsed almost immediately. The rout spread. Men threw down muskets and ran. Officers tried to stop them and were swept away. The Maryland and Delaware Continentals fought longer, but the battle was already lost. This is where Francisco's story enters the border between record and legend. Later accounts say he saw an American cannon trapped in the mud as British soldiers closed in. According to the famous version, he lifted a cannon barrel weighing hundreds of pounds onto his shoulder and carried it away so the enemy could not capture it. Some versions inflate the weight to 1,100 pounds. That cannot be accepted literally. A complete field gun and carriage could weigh that much, but the barrel alone would have been far lighter, still extraordinarily heavy, but not the impossible number repeated in legend. There is no contemporary battle report confirming the feat. The Library of Virginia notes that Francisco's surviving petitions do not describe it, so we should say exactly what the evidence allows. He fought at Camden. He survived one of the worst American disasters of the war. A powerful cannon story later became attached to his escape. Whether he carried the barrel, as tradition says, cannot now be proved. But the myth grew because it matched the soldier people remembered, the enormous Virginian who refused to abandon a weapon or a comrade while everyone else was running. If you value Revolutionary War stories that separate documented courage from later legend, subscribe. Francisco's most important recorded service was still ahead, and the next wound would nearly end his ability to walk. After Camden, Francisco returned to Virginia, but he did not leave the war. Cornwallis pushed north after the brutal fighting in the Carolinas. Virginia became a battlefield of raids, cavalry movements, destroyed supplies, and sudden clashes. Francisco equipped himself at his own expense with a horse and the necessary gear to serve as a dragoon. His petitions emphasized that point because it later became part of a compensation claim. He had not merely volunteered his body. He had purchased and risked valuable equipment the government did not provide. He served under Virginia Militia General Robert Lawson and alongside forces connected to Lieutenant Colonel William Washington's cavalry. The role suited him. A mounted volunteer could scout, raid, pursue, and strike faster than infantry. Francisco later described operations around a place he called Scotch Lake, where he and others seized horses from near British forces. Again, the documentary version is less polished than the legend, and therefore more valuable. It shows a soldier doing the rough, necessary work of the Southern War, finding mounts, disrupting enemy movement, operating with incomplete support, and surviving in a campaign where small actions mattered. Then came Guilford Courthouse. General Nathanael Greene chose ground around a rural courthouse and placed his army in 3 lines. North Carolina militia formed the first. Virginia militia stood behind them. Continental regulars formed the final line near the courthouse road. Greene's plan was not to destroy Cornwallis in one perfect blow. It was to make the British pay for every step. On March 15, 1781, Cornwallis attacked with fewer than 2,000 men against an American force of more than 4,000, but many of Greene's troops were militia, and the British soldiers advancing toward them were experienced professionals. The first line fired and gave ground. The second line fought in broken woodland, where units became separated. By the time the British reached the third line, their formations were disordered and their casualties were mounting. This is where the battle became a series of close, violent collisions. British guards struck the American Continentals. William Washington's cavalry entered the fight. Francisco was there with the Virginia troops and the mounted forces associated with Washington's command. The National Park Service still connects his name to the cavalry counterattack near the third line. The traditional story says Francisco wielded a 6-foot broadsword made specially for him, cut down 11 men, and turned the fight through raw physical power. The monument erected decades later repeats the claim. Modern historians cannot verify the 11 deaths. The American Battlefield Trust also cautions that the celebrated sword may not have existed as later described, but Francisco's own petition confirms the part that matters most. At Guilford Courthouse, he received a bayonet wound extending from his knee toward his hip. Imagine the mechanics of that injury. A bayonet does not create a clean, heroic mark. It tears cloth, skin, and muscle. It can destroy the ability to stand. Francisco was fighting close enough to the British line for a soldier to drive steel into him. He survived. The Americans eventually withdrew from the battlefield. Cornwallis technically won. But his army suffered casualties approaching 28%, compared with roughly 6 to 7% for Greene's force. The British could not easily replace those men. Greene could. Cornwallis had taken the ground and damaged his own army so badly that he soon moved toward Wilmington and then Virginia. The road that followed eventually led to Yorktown. Guilford Courthouse did not look like an American victory when the smoke cleared. Strategically, it helped break the British Southern campaign. Francisco's role should be understood at that scale. He did not single-handedly win the battle. No private soldier could. He stood in the final line of a fight designed to make Britain's victory unbearable. He was wounded helping make it so. After Guilford, Francisco's war still was not finished. His petitions indicate continued service in Virginia during Cornwallis's invasion. They also reveal the less cinematic cost of volunteering. Unpaid claims, missing documentation, and years spent asking the legislature to recognize what he had supplied and suffered. In 1784, he told Virginia lawmakers that he had served for 3 years, returned during the crisis, furnished his own horse and equipment, and received neither money, clothing, nor proper compensation. The state's response became tangled in paperwork. Officials noted that he lacked the certificates required to establish exact dates of entry and discharge. The soldier who could survive bayonets had met an enemy he could not overpower. Administrative procedure. He petitioned again. Years later, he provided more details: names, battles, wounds, officers, and losses. Among the things he wanted repaid was his horse. That detail humanizes him more than any giant's legend. The public remembered a man lifting cannon barrels. Francisco remembered the animal and equipment he had purchased with his own money and lost in public service. After the war, he returned to civilian life in Buckingham County. He worked as a blacksmith, farmed, married, raised a family, and became a recognizable figure in Virginia. His home, Locust Grove, still survives as a historic property. Later in life, he was appointed sergeant-at-arms and doorkeeper for the Virginia State Capitol in Richmond. The image is almost perfect. A child abandoned on a Virginia dock, a teenage immigrant who entered Washington's army, a private soldier wounded again and again, a man who spent his final working years guarding the doors of the government his generation had helped create. When Francisco died in 1831, his funeral was held at the state capitol. By then, legend had already begun replacing the complicated man. Stories became taller. The sword grew longer. The cannon became heavier. The number of enemies increased. A quotation was attributed to George Washington claiming that without Francisco, the revolution might have been lost. There is no reliable evidence Washington said it. We do not need it. Francisco's own petitions tell us enough. He volunteered. He served under Washington. He fought at Brandywine and Germantown. He assaulted Stony Point. He recovered from an abdominal wound. He returned for Camden. He equipped himself as cavalry. He fought at Guilford Courthouse. He survived a bayonet wound running from knee to hip. He continued serving in Virginia. That record does not describe a man Britain could not physically hurt. Britain hurt him repeatedly. The title means something more accurate. The war could cut him. It could tear his body. It could scatter his army. It could deny him pay and force him to prove his service years later. It could not make him stop returning. Today, monuments to Francisco stand at Guilford Courthouse and elsewhere. His restored Virginia home preserves the civilian life that followed the war. States have issued proclamations in his honor, and generations of descendants have kept his story alive. At Guilford Courthouse, the woods are quiet now. Visitors walk roads that once disappeared beneath smoke. The Cavalry Monument honors William Washington, Peter Francisco, and the mounted troops who entered the final struggle. Standing there, it is tempting to ask which version of Francisco we should remember. The giant of legend, the man with the impossible cannon, the swordsman surrounded by 11 fallen enemies. Remember the legends, but label them honestly. Then remember the soldier the records can prove, a a Portuguese-speaking child with no known family, a Virginia blacksmith, a private who fought across multiple states, a wounded man who returned to service when he was no longer obligated to do so. Peter Francisco was not impossible to injure. He was almost impossible to remove from the war. That is stronger than myth. If this story was worth watching, subscribe and leave a comment telling us which overlooked soldier of the American Revolution should come next.